I'm Joyce Lights, Executive Director of Connecticut Audubon Society, and I wanted to welcome you to our sixth annual Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds presentation. Before we start, I think everybody's used to our basic housekeeping notes, but you will be muted throughout the presentation. We recommend speaker view for the best viewing experience, and you'll find that in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Enter your questions in the chat. You'll find that in the pop-up bar on the bottom of the screen. This year's Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds series highlights the ways that conservation research is responding to the realities of bird population declines in the modern world. This series emphasizes effective conservation, taking our needs into consideration. The presentations will illustrate how protecting bird health and migratory corridors often overlaps with broader goals like carbon storage and equitable land use. By connecting rigorous field studies with real-world policy, these researchers will talk about how science can move from the laboratory into the hands of wildlife managers and community leaders to help stabilize vulnerable species. Tonight is the first of a series of 4. Next week, on the 12th, Shannon Curley will talk about birds and wind power. On the 26th, we'll have 4 experts, including someone from Virginia and South New Jersey, presenting about the problems that are facing the osprey. And you'll hear more about some of the work that we'll be doing in 2026 to really study what the ospreys are feeding on, and out of Long Island Sound, and some of the enhanced research we'll be doing through our Osprey Nation program. And then finally, on March 5th, Joanna Harvey from the University of Rhode Island will talk about avian flu and its effect on bird populations. All of the proceeds from Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds help fund Connecticut Audubon Society's conservation programs. So you are helping us expand our research, and we truly thank you for that. Now I'd like to invite our presenter to join me. Emily's with me here. She's a graduate student in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Connecticut. Her topic tonight is Rethinking Conservation Success, Mitigating the Climate Crisis while Benefiting Biodiversity and People. Emily, thank you so much for joining us today. Please share more about your background and your research, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thanks so much, Joyce. And thank you everyone for spending your Thursday evening learning a little bit more about conservation. I am Emily, like Joyce mentioned. I originally got interested in conservation at the University of Vermont, where I got my undergraduate degree in wildlife biology and natural resource ecology, and spent a lot of time hiking around the Green Mountains. I also have always had an interest in art and visual learning as well. So when I left UVM, and started getting involved in my conservation career, I worked for a lot of nonprofits doing a lot of mapping projects. So mapping was a great way for me to start visualizing a lot of the data that we collect about species, and visualizing it across the landscape to help plan important places to do conservation. So that's how I've spent a lot of my career for nonprofits, and also state and university research institutions. And I spent a little bit of time working for National Audubon on some of their national priority maps. So planning where we can be thinking about important places to protect bird habitat. And I'll be talking more about that project with you all today. And currently, like Joyce mentioned, I'm a PhD student at UConn, so I have since made Connecticut my home, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about conservation specifically in the Northeast and Connecticut with you all today. So let me share my screen. Okay. Can you all see the full screen presentation?
We can. Thank you.
Excellent. So like Joyce mentioned, today I want to talk to you all a little bit broadly about modern conservation and how a lot of the global issues we're facing around the globe, so climate change, biodiversity loss, social inequities, can all be kind of addressed and baked into how we're doing conservation and where we're doing conservation. And it sounds like you'll get a little bit more of a detailed look at some of the conservation work going on the ground later on in this speaker series. So today, I hope I can really set you up for a bigger picture understanding of how we go about planning that conservation. So to give you a little bit of a lay of the land of where I want to take this talk today, first, I want to give you a little bit of a history on the formation of modern conservation planning. And the conservation planning I'm talking about was really born in the early 20th century in response to observed environmental degradation and biodiversity loss due to human activity, and has since transformed into these larger area-based targets of protecting, for instance, 30% of the planet by 2030 through biodiversity. Then I want to use that background to think about how we're planning where and how to do conservation. So thinking about how we have these big conservation goals, how do we map those goals and objectives to figure out where to most effectively do conservation work on the ground? And then how do we use these maps to assess our progress towards our conservation goals and set future priorities? And then lastly, I want to give a little bit of a case study about how we use these mapping tools to get a sense of what conservation priorities should look like, for instance, in the US, and also specifically in the Northeast. All right. So if you've been to a bird talk or a biodiversity talk in the recent present, you've probably seen this paper by Rosenberg et al. In Science, where we've lost over or close to 3 billion birds since 1970, so in the past half century. And this is a continuing pattern, these dire rates of biodiversity loss, which are calling for action, conservation of these habitats for birds and biodiversity at large. And we're seeing these national and global trends, but also here in the state of Connecticut, a recent reanalysis of the Connecticut Bird Atlas has shown that 64% of breeding birds in Connecticut are declining. One such species being the wood thrush, which depends on intact large forest tracts and habitat fragmentation, forest fragmentation in Connecticut has since led to its decline over time. But perhaps more concerning is the fact that these declines are also happening in common species. So species like house sparrows and starlings that we typically think of occupying a large variety of habitats and being able to cope with a lot of different conditions are also in decline. So that raises a lot of red flags about the number of threats that these species may be facing. And so this concerning pattern of biodiversity loss has led to this global and political movement to expand our conservation areas and expand our conservation efforts to protect biodiversity. So at the most recent Conference of the Parties back in 2022, we saw this global biodiversity framework, which is this global agenda to protect 30% of lands and waters for biodiversity by 2030. And it goes by this name 30 by 30. So with this push to expand our conservation efforts, we really need to be thinking about what lands are currently in conservation and being protected and how those are contributing to this effort. because a lot of these historically protected areas we think about were not originally established for biodiversity in mind. Um, a lot of early protected areas, for instance, if we look at the national park system in the US, Yellowstone National Park was the first park established in 1872. A lot of these places were established opportunistically for iconic species or for scenic value, or they were just lands that no one saw valuable for development or resources at the time. And so, since these lands were not protected with biodiversity loss in mind, they may not be protecting species that are most vulnerable or most at risk of extinction or declining the most. And those are the species we really need to be focusing on to prevent biodiversity loss. So there may be a gap in our efforts. Um, so since then, if we flash more to modern times, we've gotten better at collecting data on species. So by monitoring species populations of species that are vulnerable or threatened and tracking their populations over time, we can start to measure and map biodiversity priorities. So if we think of eBird data, for instance, this is a snippet from the eBird status and trends website. Again, if we look at that wood thrush example I mentioned previously, we can see the red dots on this map show areas of the breeding range where populations are declining, and blue dots show areas where the population is increasing. And we can see again that decline in the Connecticut area. So by visualizing data in this way and tracking these species populations, we can start to more strategically target areas to benefit biodiversity and prevent its loss. And I just want to mention that what I'm going to be talking about in this talk and kind of a common measure of tracking changes to biodiversity at large is measuring changes in bird populations. And that's because birds are really widespread and they're really well monitored. So we have a good foundation of data to work with. And these birds also are higher up in the food chain. So they tell us a lot about, for instance, insect populations, fish, plant populations, and so they can give us a better understanding of biodiversity at large and also a wide range of habitats. So in addition to being more strategic for biodiversity, conservation is also has become more strategic at maximizing co-benefits. So here we can see over time that the total protected area across the globe has increased. And we can also see at the bottom of this graph that we've seen this increasingly diverse focus of what our conservation goals are over time. So like I mentioned early on, we were focusing on iconic landscapes and species. But since then, we've begun to recognize that protecting habitats and natural areas can have amazing benefits for people, for local economies and tourism. They provide essential ecosystem services, and they can also contribute to things like carbon mitigation to slow climate change. So I think this was mentioned early on, but Brooke Bateman, Dr. Brooke Bateman also gave a talk in the same speaker series back in 2022. And Brooke really introduced this concept of co-beneficial conservation. Her take-home message was, birds are telling us it's time to act on climate change. And basically what Brooke was explaining is organizations like National Audubon, who are trying to protect these habitats for birds, especially these habitats that are expected to be lost as climate begins to change. We can also recognize that these habitats themselves can help mitigate climate change. So these trees, these plants are sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. They're storing it in their live and their dead biomass and in the soil. So we can simultaneously protect habitat for birds and also mitigate some of the most pressing future threats to them at the same time if we plan strategically. So in addition to conservation being beneficial for climate change, mitigating climate change, um, conservation obviously has benefits for people. And if we think about how these benefits are distributed, a lot of times we see that they're not distributed equitably across communities. So there's a lot of statistics that show oftentimes trees and green space, for instance, tend to be less dense in urbanized areas, typically with greater populations of marginalized communities. And these green spaces, these trees offer a number of benefits, such as clean air and water. They provide shade, which can prevent urban heat island effects, and they have amazing benefits for mental health. So if we think about doing conservation, we can really start to address some of these inequities in environmental benefits by doing conservation in areas that need these green spaces the most. And in addition to environmental benefits being distributed inequitably, environmental hazards are as well. So if we look at Connecticut, for example, this is a map showing darker blue areas indicating more communities that have more polluting sources within them, and also that have greater potential health sensitivities to these polluting sources. And we can see that these dark blue areas are concentrated again in these urban areas like Hartford, Waterbury, New Haven, and Bridgeport. And simultaneously, these communities tend to have the highest populations of low income and racial and ethnic minorities in the state. So all this to say, planning strategically where we do conservation to also offset a lot of these social inequities we see can ensure that we're maximizing benefits to people as well. And so a lot of these co-beneficial conservation planning strategies go by the terms natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions. And these strategies basically are about protecting both natural and modified ecosystems to harness, again, the natural abilities of plants and soils, to sequester carbon and provide benefits to people. So conservation, at least modern conservation, is really focused on planning where we do conservation in a way that protects habitats that are mitigating biodiversity loss, climate change, and improving human well-being at the same time. So these are kind of three global issues that are really commonly focused on. So I just talked a little bit about how we can more strategically plan where to do conservation. But another question we should be asking is who lives in these areas we want to do conservation in. So if we think about expanding our protected areas to 30% of the globe, and there's even other goals to expand that to 50% of the globe in 2050, these expanding these conservation areas are going to lead to greater overlap with people living in those areas. And conservation has in the past and has the potential to also displace people in current land uses. So kind of the traditional way of thinking about conservation was really keeping people out and keeping these natural areas pristine and free from human influence. And while this way of preserving habitat can be really beneficial to species because habitat loss is one of the key drivers of extinction and biodiversity loss, it can also restrict access to these lands, which can cut off a lot of historical and cultural ties for people who depend on those lands and who were the original owners of those lands. It can also change the way we manage our natural resources so it can offset people's livelihoods, for instance, who depend on the natural resources in those areas. Um, so it can displace current land uses, and it can also physically displace people financially. Um, so there's this concept of green gentrification, and this concept is really about how we restore or introduce green space into an area. And doing this increases property values or an area's attractiveness. And in doing so, this increase in property values displaces residents of typically marginalized groups. Um, and so one example of this is Brooklyn's Prospect Park. This is a park that was originally designed to bring wealth into the area. And it underwent a rehabilitation project in the late 1980s to increase the park's amenities to the community. And in this process, there was clear redlining of where white immigrants should be relocated directly adjacent to the park. And as soon as the project was finished, we later saw the white populations directly surrounding the park increase, Black populations decrease, and overall income increase. So this has really led to this concept of how green is green enough. How can we introduce these green spaces to meet community needs while also maintaining the costs of living in the area so we're not displacing the current residents? And so all of this to say, strict conservation and protection of lands isn't always the solution. There's been a greater acceptance of other forms of land management that can benefit biodiversity while also supporting the communities that already live there. So land easements, for instance, can keep land in sustainable agriculture, where we can use clean air and water practices. And it also protects these agricultural areas, for instance, from being converted into more urbanized and developed land uses. And a great example from Connecticut, the Mashantucket Pequot tribe recently received a federal grant to improve their production and infrastructure to be more productive while also having cleaner air and water, and soil, and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So a lot of these federal incentive programs that see protecting current land uses and environmental quality as two simultaneous and compatible goals are really going to be important at supporting these co-beneficial land management strategies in the future. So that was a little bit about how we got to this concept of co-beneficial conservation. And so now I want to talk a little bit about a behind the scenes look at how we can map these conservation goals and evaluate our progress towards area-based targets like 30 by 30. So the framework I'm going to share with you all today is a project that I worked on with National Audubon Society. And the goal was really to, again, start planning how National Audubon looked across the entire US to prioritize important places to protect for birds that can also benefit climate mitigation and human equity. So I want to shout out to my co-authors who really helped push this work forward and develop a lot of the visuals you're going to see today. So like I mentioned, at National Audubon, our scale was the contiguous US, so the mainland states as well as Alaska. And what we were trying to evaluate was the current US protected area network and how well it was targeting biodiversity, climate change, and people. So here you can see the areas in dark and light green are areas currently either protected or managed for biodiversity. And the gray and the white areas currently don't have that federal status. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about how we went about mapping these priority areas. And I'm going to breeze through how we map priorities for birds and carbon because Brooke kind of introduced this in her talk back in 2022. But basically, we mapped important places for birds as habitats that are currently supporting birds that are expected to persist in the future under different climate change scenarios. And we call these areas of persistent habitat climate strongholds because we expect them to support bird biodiversity in the long term. So of those habitats that were important for birds, we again looked at which were currently storing a lot of carbon or actively taking carbon out of the atmosphere, or could do both those things if they were restored. And we called these habitats that benefit both birds and climate change our bird and carbon priorities. And what I really want to focus on today is how we then incorporated this third component of human well-being. So we basically took those habitats that were important for birds and carbon and looked at what communities they fell within. And we defined a community as a census tract. Basically, we tried identifying census tracts that were facing some of those environmental inequities I was talking about before. And so habitats that were important for birds and carbon and also fell within a community that was facing some of those inequities, we called our priorities for birds, carbon, and humans. So how did we identify these priorities for people? Where did we identify these nature-based inequities? Again, we looked at census tracts and we looked at this, the CDC's social vulnerability tool, which basically highlighted communities that had limited resources to prepare and respond to disasters and hazards. So these were communities, for instance, that may be facing language barriers or have limited transportation to, again, respond to disasters and hazards. And of these socially vulnerable communities, we identified our priorities for people if these communities faced at least one more environmental inequity. And we looked at four potential inequities. The first being chronic health issues. So the prevalence of low physical activity, of heart disease, asthma, diabetes. We looked at the potential for environmental hazards and climate-related hazards. So this was, I think, a FEMA tool that looked at the potential property damage and loss of life, again, due to environmental hazards. We looked at limited access to nature. So communities that had no publicly accessible natural areas within them. And then we looked at the prevalence of polluting sources within each of these communities. And we took the communities that were in the top 1/5 in the nation for having the highest inequities in each of these four categories, and we called those our priorities for people. All right, so I talked a little bit about how we identified our conservation priorities. But another thing we wanted to do with our mapping exercise was to figure out who might be living in these areas, again, where we want to do conservation. And I wanted to show you this map just to highlight that. So these are showing all of the priority areas we found for birds and carbon, colored by land ownership. And we can see that most of our bird and carbon priorities are in gray, which means, which shows private lands. So this is to say the government ideally could do all it can to protect biodiversity, but we're really going to have to rely on providing incentives and educating and working with landowners to figure out how we can benefit biodiversity in a way that aligns with their current land uses in these areas. So we looked at three potential ways that conservation has historically impacted communities and called these land dependencies. So these were community attributes that could cause a community to be potentially affected by changes to how we manage natural resources in those areas. So the first land dependency we looked at was an occupational dependency. So we looked at the percent of a census tract employed in natural resource industries. So agriculture, forestry, fishing and hunting, and mining. We looked at any cultural dependencies. So for this, we looked at federally recognized and state recognized indigenous land boundaries. And then we looked at the potential for green gentrification again. So this was looking at urban areas that were facing the highest housing cost burdens in the US. And basically, a housing cost burden is when a household is spending the majority of its income on housing costs. So these were communities that would most likely be affected and potentially displaced with any increases in the cost of living in these areas. All right, so that was a behind the scenes look at how we did this mapping. And now I want to talk a little bit about our results and how we can use those to inform our progress towards 30 by 30. So this map here is showing in green all of the areas we identified as priorities for birds and carbon. And this is looking across a bunch of different habitats. So forest habitat, grassland habitat, coastlands, urban, suburban habitat. And these light brown areas show of those bird and carbon priorities, which also fall within those communities that were facing those inequities we looked at. So these are priorities that could benefit birds, carbon, and people. And then the light green and dark green and dark brown areas on this map just show of those priorities for birds, carbon, and people, which fall within the communities that have one of those three land dependencies we looked at. And this is just a little link in the top right corner here where you can go to National Audubon's mapping tool for this project, and you can explore a lot of these areas in more detail, see what data went into them, even break it down by habitat types to get a closer look. Okay, so how did we use this map to track our current progress towards 30 by 30 in the US? So if we think of this progress bar here as our progress towards protecting 30% of the US area. If we look again at just the federally recognized protected areas in the US, we're about halfway to our 30% goal. But of those protected areas, if we look at how many of them are addressing those priorities for birds and carbon we highlighted, only about half the US protected area network is focused on those bird and carbon areas. And just about 3% more are focused on birds, carbon, and people. So again, depending on how we define our conservation goals and what we define as conservation success, it can change our progress towards 30 by 30 and these area-based targets. So only 10% of the US is currently a protected priority for birds, carbon, and people. And I've shown those areas on this map here. So just as a comparison, I wanted to show and ask how targeted are protected areas in the Northeast compared to the US at large. So if we think of this progress bar here as all of the protected areas in the Northeast, 90% of those protected areas fell within a priority for bird and carbon that we identified. An additional 8% also addressed priorities for people. So we can see that in the Northeast, at least in comparison, we're a lot more targeted on being more strategic about where we do conservation and trying to address these three goals. So those were protected conservation priorities. And now I want to talk about all of the conservation priorities we identified that are still on, that still lack protection. And these are opportunities for co-beneficial conservation as we think about progressing towards 30 by 30 in the future. So 3/4 of our conservation priorities we identified are unprotected, meaning there's ample opportunity to make sure we're strategically doing more co-beneficial conservation in the future. And I also want to highlight that 80% of these priorities fell within at least one of those land dependencies that we looked at. So we can see the majority of this map is in that dark green and dark brown. And I want to highlight that we only looked at 3 potential land dependencies just because of data limitations. But there's a lot more ways that communities can be affected by conservation. For instance, we couldn't look at historically Black communities or energy dependencies in these areas. So this is likely an underestimate of how we could potentially impact communities living in these areas. So this is all to say, strict protection of lands may not be the best conservation solution, and we're really going to have to think about what conservation looks like locally and work with these communities to find what these conservation goals are. So based on this mapping exercise, what might be priorities for conservation in the Northeast? So if we look just at the Northeast, a lot of these priorities for birds and carbon are the nation's forested habitats. And we also have a lot of urban and suburban habitats in the Northeast. So these are really important for sequestering and storing carbon. And surprisingly, urban suburban habitats, urban suburban forests are really great at sequestering carbon because these urban landscapes have a lot more nutrient runoff, and there's often more space for these trees to grow larger faster. These urban and suburban habitats are also really important stopover habitats for birds. If we think about birds migrating across Long Island Sound, they're hitting a lot of urbanized areas along the coast, Bridgeport, New Haven. And so having these pockets of green space to provide stopover habitat is really important. So that's a little bit about important habitats for birds and carbon. And I also want to talk about what some of the greatest inequities we found. So across the US at large, limited access to nature was the most prevalent inequity we found in our bird, carbon, and people priority areas, followed by health complications, exposure to pollution, and climate hazards. And we found a similar trend in the Northeast, where, again, thinking about improving access to nature is going to be really important. Health complications and pollution as well. And lastly, climate hazards. And I don't want this graph to downplay the importance of thinking about climate change, of course. And if we think about sea level rise, especially along our coasts, increasing erosion and causing increased flooding, it is really going to be important to think about climate hazards as well. But overall, I just want to mention this point that improving access to green space is going to be a key consideration. And then I also wanted to highlight some of the most prevalent land dependencies we found. So at the US at large, natural resource industry was one of the greatest land dependencies we found, especially in the central and western part of the US, followed by green gentrification and then indigenous lands. But we saw this reversal in the Northeast where green gentrification was actually the most prevalent land dependency in our region, followed by the natural resource industry and indigenous lands. So conservation in the Northeast is especially going to have to evaluate this cost of living when we're trying to plan conservation in these areas. So what might this look like and what can we work towards and support in the Northeast? So like I mentioned, our forest habitats are really important. So finding ways to support and educate and incentivize land managers to partake in more sustainable forest management is one really key goal. One example being this Maple Managed for Birds program, where maple syrup producers, for instance, can try to make their forests be more supportive of bird habitat by leaving down woody debris, for instance, um, leaving snags, which all offer great habitat for birds. Um, Creating more equitable access to green space, again, was really important for the Northeast. So one example is Audubon Connecticut's Urban Oasis program, which has introduced a lot of pockets of green space into schoolyards and parks in New Haven. And this program is really focused on trying to introduce these spaces into communities that may be facing some of these inequities in clean air and water and access to biodiversity in green space. And so Audubon has really focused on just providing knowledge, for instance, on what plants could be beneficial for birds and people, and is really focusing on having this be a community-led event. So it's provided a great opportunity for education, youth leadership, and also just creating some more tranquil spaces in these urban environments. And lastly, I wanted to talk about some anti-displacement strategies, again, to prevent green gentrification in a lot of these areas where we're looking at one way or one anti-displacement strategy are these community land trusts. And if you're like me, who did not know the difference between a community land trust and a conservation land trust until like 5 days ago, a community land trust, or I guess to start, a conservation land trust is really about protecting the land for biodiversity, whereas a community land trust is more focused on sustaining affordable housing. So these land trusts essentially take land out of the cost of the housing on their properties. So that allows them to make changes such as creating community gardens or creating green space for the community needs without raising the cost of housing in those areas. All right, so I just wanted to end and leave you all with a couple of the key messages that I took away from working on this project of what conservation planning is and should look like in the future. It should be focused on targeting co-benefits. So protecting biodiversity is obviously key, but recognizing that protecting these habitats can have benefits for people and mitigating climate change should take part in the way we plan conservation. Conservation should be locally collaborative. And again, thinking about working with the people who are living in these areas and recognizing that there's alternative goals and solutions to protect biodiversity that isn't necessarily strict protection. And with that, thank you so much for your time. And I'm happy to talk more later if you want to contact me at my email. And happy to talk now, answer any questions. Thank you.
Emily, thank you. Hi, everybody. It's Tom Anderson. I'm the communications director at Connecticut Audubon. We have a few questions, all of them from one person. I would like to encourage you to ask more questions if you have them, and I have a couple myself, but we're going to start with Michelle Millman. I'm sorry, I mispronounced that. It's Michelle Millam, I believe. I've corresponded with her via email, but I've never actually talked to her. So her questions, she says that she had not heard about 30 by 30 or 50 by 50. What percent of the planet is currently protected? In other words, is 30 by 30 a real stretch or is it realistic?
That is a great question. I should have looked up that statistic before coming to you all
Sorry.
today. Um, I can definitely follow up. There's definitely some good papers out there that have that statistic, and I want to say off the top of my head that our progress in the US kind of reflects the global statistic as well, which is to say we're on our way, but we have a ways to go. And I'm sorry, I don't have the exact number on the top of
Oh,
my head.
that's fine. That was a tough one. Yeah. So her further question was, um, how is your research impacted by current changes in public funding in science? And what are your hopes for the future of this research? And before you answer that, this was one of the topics that we tried to cover not very quickly, actually. We tried to cover in our 2025 Connecticut State of the Birds report, where we looked into what's going to be the future of science being conducted by young scientists who are trying to conserve birds if funding is drying up. So tell us about that.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if this question was more addressed to how is this impacting the work at Audubon, or my work here as a grad student, currently. But I guess I can speak on to being a grad student and being someone trying to get into the field and my perspective of my peers. And I would say it's not as bad as we thought it would be. Like there's still a lot of um, funding from the private and state sectors, um, that is still supporting a lot of work. Um, but yeah, there is a little bit uncertainty and I guess a lot of hesitation um, to move towards the more federal side of things. And having that kind of uncertainty there has definitely slowed some things down and I think made a lot of people hesitant. But I would say the general consensus is people are still motivated to do the work. And I think there's a lot of um, acceptance of as long as we're still willing to do it and we have a community behind us, like the work is still going to get done. So um, I would say honestly, it hasn't been as big of an impact as I thought it would be. But certainly, I've known a lot of people who um, have been impacted and a lot of work that has not been able to go through um, because of the funding impacts. So it's a mixed bag.
I have a couple of questions. First, a favor. Will you unshare your screen so we could see you a little better?
Yes.
Thank you. And
Thank
um,
you.
my question is, do you are there examples of places where you think nature-based solutions is being carried out and people and organizations or people are doing it well? Where is it? Where have you seen it working? If or is it or at this point is it still too early to think that there are places that are succeeding at it?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the best examples when I was working at Audubon, an example we used a lot was their conservation ranching program, um, where they were working with landowners to create more sustainable ranching practices. And again, our grasslands are just as important as our forests at sequestering carbon and storing carbon. So I thought that was a really great example of ways to sustain current land uses and again provide important habitats for birds and climate change. So yeah, even I don't know, there's a lot of work going on in more urban and suburban areas. I mean, I'm seeing it a lot more and more in conservation planning documents at the federal, local, and state and nonprofit levels. So I think it's really prevalent in a lot of conservation planning right now.
We had an example in our 2025 State of the Birds of a project being conducted by um, Highstead Foundation, which is in Reading, Connecticut, and Cornell Lab of Ornithology and the Kent Land Trust, where they're working to with landowners to try to protect and this seems to me like an example of nature-based solutions about what's known as the Macedonia Forest Block in Litchfield County. I think it's about
Mm,
23,000 acres. It's a fairly new project, but I think their idea is that they don't want to do typical land trust preservation parcel by parcel. They wanted to combine so that they can reach more people and more large landowners and sort of convey the benefits of land preservation for birds among that community. Um,
mm,
they were very excited about it. They wrote a good article. People on this call who are members of Connecticut Audubon may remember it from their report, which we mailed to them. But it also reminds me of the one of the issues of green gentrification, um, is that land values around protected areas become so high that it's difficult for people who are land rich and cash poor to continue to live there. They end up
mm,
selling to, well, like, I mean, Litchfield County is well known for being a place where frankly, lots of rich people live because they can afford it. And so it's beautifully preserved, but my guess is that the less well-off members of the community eventually get pushed out. Um,
yeah.
so here's another question. This is from, um, give me 1 second while I look up the name again.
Linda Miller.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
I still have problems seeing. I copied and pasted it into a Google Doc so I could make it bigger. The question has to do with state wildlife management areas. And Linda asks, do you have any idea how wildlife management areas fit into this plan? Are they more old school conservation, or do you think they'll continue to play an important role?
Yeah. I mean, I think even again, I am not the best person to ask about state wildlife management areas, but um, I don't know, even protecting, like I mentioned, habitat for biodiversity has its benefits. It's protecting habitat. And like I mentioned, a lot of species in Connecticut even are declining because of habitat fragmentation. Um, so in any way of protecting large tracts of habitat is important, um, and has benefits for biodiversity.
It looked to me when you were showing the maps, and the scale weren't exactly drilling down at the small areas, but it looked to me like you'd have a hard time finding an area in Connecticut that was not a priority for conservation. Was I just not seeing that well enough, or is that pretty much the case?
Yeah, so those maps were pretty coarse-grained in Connecticut, but Connecticut um, was an interesting state when I was looking at it up close because it had the greatest mix and like even divide of priorities for birds and people. So I think in other states in the Northeast, it was a lot more focused on birds and carbon, but we actually had a lot more um, tracts of habitat that were in priorities for people as well. So I think that was something unique to the state. Um, so I'm not sure if those state wildlife or protected areas in the state were actually um, where they fell within that, but I think we are, based on our analysis, targeting a lot of co-beneficial areas that we identified.
Um, Steve Broker mentioned something that you mentioned earlier as well, and that is that the Connecticut Bird Atlas, which is still only preliminarily finished, it still has plenty of good information already, and you can find it on the CT Bird Atlas website. Um,
Yes. Yeah. My advisor was leading a lot of that work, so he was very adamant of you should say something about the Connecticut Bird Atlas in
yeah,
there.
well, Connecticut Audubon is one of the prime sponsors of it. We contributed a fair amount of money for that project. So is your advisor Chris Elphick?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Of course we know Chris. This may be outside of your area of expertise as well, but the next question is, do you have practical suggestions for us as landowners? I'd like to understand more about land management.
Yeah.
Uh,
So
I recognize that that may not be exactly the kind of thing you specialize in.
I am definitely coming more from the person working with the data and providing the maps and less on the ground in a lot of these things. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think doing some research to find local programs in your area because there are, I'm sure, a lot of programs that can provide educational materials or even resources to start thinking about how to integrate some of those more sustainable land practices um, can help get a better sense of those options. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it would depend on what type of land we're talking about here, and um, again, having a sense of also what you as the landowner want to and envision the land uses in the future, and then how those might align with, again, the habitat that's currently on the land. So it does take some evaluating to see what the historical habitat might have been in the area, what it is now, and what kind of habitat it could provide for biodiversity in the future. So yeah, I mean, having some of those thought processes for sure.
One of the things worth mentioning is that it is fairly easy to find online good information about how to turn your own property into a better habitat for birds and pollinators. And in fact, Connecticut Audubon has a feature on our website that we call Homegrown Habitat, written by Sarah Midlier, one of our board members. She's a landscape designer. And it's gone on now monthly for about 3 years, and anyone could look at it now and pick out 5 or 6 native plants that she's talking about and follow her general advice and just improve your property for birds and pollinators and other wildlife just by doing that. It's I think it's one of those areas where small improvements can make a big difference for your own enjoyment of your property, but also for the birds and the insects that are there as well. Um, we have another question from see if I can see who that one's from. Debbie Hassler, who wants to know if, not if, but how do you and other researchers adjust the maps like the ones you showed us as the range of birds shifts northward with climate change?
Yeah, so one strategy, well, it is about constant monitoring. So an interesting project that we had at National Audubon, I'm forgetting the actual name of it, but Audubon created these climate maps, which basically takes future projections of what we think the climate is going to do based on these different scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions. And based on that, we can determine, okay, the climate is going to change in this way, and habitats may respond in this way. So we can map out where climate is expected to shift and habitats are expected to shift over time. Um, and then this program at National Audubon is specifically looking for people to monitor and detect species in these areas we're expecting a lot of changes in. So by sending people out to areas with projected change, we can actually focus our monitoring efforts on seeing if those changes are actually taking place, the changes we predicted, and then adjusting our maps accordingly. So it's been a really great blend of, again, using kind of these scientific projections of what we think the climate and the habitat is going to do, and then using um, community volunteers to go out and collect data on where we're seeing these changes on the ground.
So one last question before we wrap up, and this was more of a personal one. We call this series "Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds." We make a point of finding young scientists, not just scientists, artists, and photographers, etc. When we did our State of the Birds report in 2025, we called it Conservation Works, Building a Better Future for Birds, and we made a point of finding young generation authors to write about it. And the point of all that is because those of us of my generation, we may have caused the problem, but we're not going to be here to fix it. You are. And so what I wonder is, in the face of what seems to be not overwhelming, but pretty tough odds, how does a young scientist like yourself continue to be optimistic about what you can accomplish?
Yeah, I think it's really about surrounding myself with amazing mentors and peers, and um, I don't know, being in more of the applied side of research. I get to see a lot of what's actually going on the ground and how we're implementing a lot of these conservation strategies that we think about behind the scenes with data and what it actually looks like. Um, so I think getting to being in that part of conservation allows me to see what people are doing on the ground more and interact with those land managers. So I don't know, just seeing that there is such a big community of people who are dedicated to doing the work and who are doing the work. And even being here with like the broader Connecticut Audubon community, like seeing all these people willing to spend a Thursday night um, talking about these sorts of things just, makes me recognize that um, it's not just me, it's not a solo movement, that we're all here for it.
Well, great. Thank you. That was terrific. We really appreciate it. Um,
Thank you all.
I have a couple of words of closing. Um, Joyce, any chance you could spotlight me for a couple of minutes? I will make it really brief. Um, there we go. Thank you. So really, all I wanted to say is thank you again to Emily. The presentation was fascinating. It was also a lot. I found myself looking at the screen and trying to listen and really trying to absorb as much as I can. And I'm looking forward to watching the video myself. For everybody who's signed up for this, we'll, as always, send you the video when it's ready in a few days. Don't forget, next week is Shannon Curley. Some of you may remember Shannon. She did a presentation on grassland birds of Staten Island at Fresh Kills. I think it was in 2022. And most importantly, the people we always like to thank most sincerely is all of you, the folks who are watching, and to all of our members and supporters. We think Connecticut Audubon is doing really good and really important conservation work, and we absolutely could not do it without your support and your generosity. So thank you sincerely, and thanks for signing up to this. Hope to see you next week.